Something important is happening in Ouagadougou, and it is not simply another airport project or another aircraft arriving on a runway. In July 2026, aviation officials and technical experts from across Africa gathered in Burkina Faso to discuss something most passengers will never see: the procedures that help aircraft approach airports, land safely, and move through an increasingly connected African sky. That raises a much bigger question. What if one of Africa's next important aviation corridors is being built long before most people can see it? Under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is pushing infrastructure, reorganizing airport management, and trying to strengthen national aviation capacity. At the same time, Ouagadougou hosted the 12th Steering Committee meeting of the African Flight Procedure Program, an initiative that began years before Traore came to power. That distinction matters. Traore did not create this African program, but its arrival in Ouagadougou comes at a remarkable moment when his government is trying to modernize airports and give Burkina Faso a stronger position in regional transportation. The ambition is visible on several fronts. The long-running Ouagadougou-Donsine Airport project remains central to the country's aviation future. Bobo Dioulasso is undergoing major modernization. Burkina Faso has also created a dedicated company to manage and develop its airports. Behind the concrete and runways, another effort is underway, building the technical expertise needed to operate a modern aviation system safely. But ambition is not the same as achievement. Can a landlocked nation facing serious security and economic pressures really turn Ouagadougou into a more important gateway for Africa? Or will the vision remain larger than the traffic, routes, and infrastructure needed to sustain it? That is the question we will test with evidence, not slogans. And as we follow this story, don't forget to share your thoughts and tell us where you are watching from. Every comment helps amplify Africa's voice across the globe, because the real story is not simply whether Burkina Faso can build airports. It is whether Africans can connect African cities with African expertise, stronger institutions, and a shared vision for the continent's future. To understand why the gathering in Ouagadougou matters, we need to look beyond Burkina Faso. The African Flight Procedure Program was not created in 2026, and it was not created by Ibrahim Traore. It dates back to 2014 and was developed within the framework of the International Civil Aviation Organization to help African states strengthen an essential part of modern aviation. By November 2021, 35 African countries were participating in the program. Its steering committee has met in different African nations over the years. The 11th meeting took place in Lusaka, Zambia, in 2025. Then, from July 15th through July 17th, 2026, the 12th meeting brought aviation authorities and specialists to Ouagadougou. That history is important because it prevents us from exaggerating what Burkina Faso has achieved. Ouagadougou did not suddenly become Africa's aviation capital simply because it hosted one meeting. But hosting this gathering placed Burkina Faso inside a much larger continental conversation at a particularly important moment in its own development. African aviation is not only about connecting Africa with Europe, North America, the Middle East, or Asia. There is another challenge much closer to home, making it easier and safer for African countries to connect with one another. That requires more than buying aircraft. It requires common standards, reliable airports, trained specialists, safe flight procedures, and cooperation across national borders. Burkina Faso's authorities connected the Ouagadougou meeting with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the broader effort to create a more integrated African air transport market. That changes the meaning of what might otherwise sound like a highly technical conference. A flight procedure designed in one country may seem far removed from Pan-African cooperation. But when African states develop compatible standards and share technical knowledge, they create the foundation on which more reliable connections can eventually be built. And that brings us to a part of aviation almost nobody sees. Because before Africa can connect its cities with more flights, it needs people who understand how to guide those aircraft safely through the sky. Most travelers judge an airport by what they can see. They notice the terminal, the runway, the aircraft, and perhaps the control tower. But some of the most important aviation infrastructure is invisible to the passenger. Think of a new highway. Building smooth pavement is not enough. Drivers still need signs, clearly marked exits, traffic rules, and people capable of managing the system safely. Aviation works in much the same way. Aircraft need carefully designed procedures that tell crews how to depart, approach, and land under defined conditions. These procedures must meet international safety standards, and they must be designed, checked, maintained, and updated by qualified specialists. This is where the African Flight Procedure Program becomes important. Its purpose is not simply to tell African countries what rules they should follow. A major part of the effort is developing the technical capacity that allows African states to implement and maintain those standards themselves. Look at what happened in 2026. From February 2nd through February 27th, flight procedure specialists received training in Nairobi, Kenya. Then, from June 8th through June 25th, another program was held in Accra, Ghana, focusing on preparing instructors who could help train others. Less than a month later, aviation representatives gathered in Ouagadougou to discuss the direction of the wider African program. Nairobi, Accra, Ouagadougou, 3 African cities performing different roles within the same effort. That sequence reveals something important about the meaning of self-reliance. Africa does not become more independent simply by purchasing expensive equipment from abroad. Long-term capacity grows when African engineers, technicians, instructors, and aviation authorities develop knowledge that can be shared from one country to another. Human expertise is infrastructure too. A runway can be photographed, a terminal can be inaugurated, a new aircraft can attract a crowd. Technical knowledge is less visible, but without it, those investments cannot reach their full potential. And this is where the story in Burkina Faso becomes much more interesting. Because while African specialists are strengthening the invisible infrastructure above the continent, Burkina Faso is attempting to transform the physical infrastructure on the ground. The invisible infrastructure matters, but Burkina Faso is also betting heavily on concrete, runways, terminals, and airport capacity. The most ambitious example is the long-running Ouagadougou-Donsin International Airport project. This project began well before Ibrahim Traore came to power, so it would be misleading to present it as his creation. What his government inherited was a major project with enormous potential, but also delays, technical concerns, organizational problems, and additional costs. The planned runway at Donsin is approximately 2.17 miles long, with the possibility of extending it to roughly 2.49 miles. It is designed with the capacity to accommodate large, wide-body aircraft. But a long runway alone does not make an international hub. The airport must be completed, certified, efficiently managed, and connected to a viable network of routes. Then there is Bobo Dioulasso. Burkina Faso is undertaking a major modernization of the city's international airport. The investment is approximately 79 billion CFA francs, roughly 140 million United States dollars, using the conversion applied to this project. Plans include a new terminal designed to handle at least 1.5 million passengers per year, improvements to aviation infrastructure, expanded cargo facilities, and better connections with the city. By August 5, 2026, physical progress on the project stood at 17.23%, with more than 500 workers involved. Those numbers are important because they separate construction already underway from promises about the future. Together, Donsin and Bobo Dioulasso suggest that Burkina Faso is thinking beyond a single airport. One could become a stronger gateway for the capital, while the other could develop into an important transportation and commercial center. But this is also where expectations must meet reality. New terminals do not guarantee passengers. Runways do not automatically create routes. Expensive infrastructure does not produce prosperity unless airlines, businesses, cargo operators, and travelers actually use it. Burkina Faso is building physical pieces of a larger aviation strategy. The next question is, who is organizing those pieces into a functioning system? And that brings Ibrahim Traore directly into the story. Ibrahim Traore's role in this aviation story needs to be understood carefully. He did not design Burkina Faso's flight procedures, and he did not create every airport project now under construction. His more important role is political, setting priorities, approving institutions, and pushing infrastructure toward a broader national strategy. A revealing decision came in June 2025. The Council of Ministers, chaired by Traore, approved the creation of a dedicated company responsible for managing and developing Burkina Faso's airports. That may sound less dramatic than opening a new terminal, but institutions often determine whether expensive infrastructure succeeds after the construction crews leave. Under Traore, the government has increasingly presented transportation infrastructure as a strategic national asset. The objective is not simply to move passengers. Better airports can support trade, investment, cargo movement, tourism, and connections between Burkina Faso and neighboring economies. Air Burkina is another piece of that strategy. The National Development Plan identifies the recovery of the airline and the acquisition of 2 aircraft among recent transportation achievements. 2 aircraft cannot turn Ouagadougou into a continental hub, but the move illustrates something larger. Airports need airlines, airlines need routes, and routes need passengers. Each part depends on the others. This is also where Traore's language of sovereignty becomes relevant. Real aviation sovereignty does not mean closing Burkina Faso's airspace to international cooperation. In fact, modern aviation makes isolation almost impossible. Aircraft cross borders, safety standards must be compatible. Pilots, airports, airlines, and air traffic systems must cooperate. A more practical definition of sovereignty is having enough domestic capacity to make choices from a stronger position. That means training Burkinabe and African specialists, building capable institutions, developing infrastructure, and choosing partnerships according to national interests rather than permanent dependence on a single outside power. Traore can provide political momentum for that direction, but no president can build an aviation ecosystem alone. Engineers, airport managers, pilots, technicians, airlines, businesses, and passengers will ultimately determine whether the strategy works, and if those pieces begin working together, the implications extend far beyond Burkina Faso. They lead directly to a much larger ambition: connecting African economies more effectively with one another. If Burkina Faso's aviation strategy is going to matter beyond its borders, it must connect with a much larger African project. The African Union has been working toward the single African air transport market, an initiative designed to make air travel between African countries more open and connected. By 2025, 38 countries had committed to the initiative. African Union reporting in 2026 indicated that 26 participating states had fully opened their markets under the framework. The economic argument is significant. According to African Union figures, 113 new routes within Africa had been created since 2019. Those connections were estimated to contribute about 800 million United States dollars to economic output and support roughly 60,000 jobs. Those numbers help explain why aviation can become much more than a transportation story. For a landlocked country like Burkina Faso, every reliable air connection can become a bridge to another market. A passenger flight can carry business people and families. Cargo capacity can help move valuable goods faster. Better connections can make regional investment and commercial relationships easier. Consider one practical example. In 2025, leaders from Ghana and Burkina Faso discussed the possibility of daily flights between Accra and Ouagadougou. That is what Pan-African connectivity looks like when political language becomes something ordinary people can actually use. It becomes a departure time on a schedule. It becomes a businessman reaching another African capital without an unnecessary journey through a distant hub. It becomes families traveling more easily and companies gaining faster access to customers. This is where Ouagadougou's opportunity becomes interesting. Burkina Faso does not need to replace the continent's established aviation centers to become important. It could instead strengthen its position as one useful connecting point within a broader African network. But geography alone will not make that happen. Ouagadougou needs reliable infrastructure, competitive airlines, frequent routes, trained professionals, safe operations, and enough passenger and cargo demand to sustain those connections. The African Union can help create a more open continental framework. Individual governments can build airports, airlines can open routes, but ultimately, a Pan-African aviation network becomes real only when Africans can use it to reach one another more easily. And that is also why claims that powerful outsiders are determined to stop this project deserve careful examination. This is where the story becomes politically sensitive. Across social media, a dramatic claim is often repeated. Western powers are afraid of Ibrahim Traore because Burkina Faso is becoming more sovereign and because Africa is beginning to control its own future. The evidence demands a more careful conclusion. There is no credible evidence that the United States or European governments opposed the aviation meeting in Ouagadougou simply because African countries were cooperating on safer flight procedures. In fact, the African Flight Procedure Program operates within the framework of the International Civil Aviation Organization and International Aviation Standards. Western criticism of Traore has focused on different issues: military rule, the timetable for a return to civilian government, human rights, security, relations with Russia, and control of natural resources. One particularly controversial moment came in 2025. United States General Michael Langley publicly raised allegations concerning Burkina Faso's gold revenues and suggested that some of those resources were being used to protect the military government. The statement was real. So was the anger it generated. Thousands of people demonstrated in Burkina Faso in support of Traore, and many interpreted Langley's remarks as another example of a foreign power judging how an African country should manage its own resources. But there is an important distinction. Langley made an allegation. His public statement did not, by itself, provide enough evidence to treat every part of that allegation as conclusively proven. The opposite claim also requires evidence. We cannot simply conclude that Washington criticized Traore because the United States fears an independent Burkina Faso. This distinction matters. Africans have legitimate historical reasons to question foreign influence, unequal relationships, and outside control over strategic resources. But genuine sovereignty becomes stronger when it can withstand scrutiny based on facts. The aviation story gives us a useful example. If Burkina Faso develops its airports, trains its people, strengthens its institutions, and expands African connections, those results can be measured. They do not require a conspiracy theory to become meaningful. And perhaps the most serious test of Traore's leadership is not what Western officials say about him. It is whether the transformation promised at home produces lasting results for the people of Burkina Faso. The hardest test for Ibrahim Traore may come from a reality that no airport terminal can hide. Burkina Faso is trying to build for the future while confronting a severe security crisis in the present. Armed violence did not begin when Traore came to power in 2022. Burkina Faso had already been struggling for years with militant attacks, displaced communities, and instability spreading across the Sahel. It would therefore be inaccurate to blame him for creating the crisis. But it would be equally misleading to suggest that the problem has been solved. That matters because aviation depends on confidence. Airlines consider security before opening routes. Investors consider stability before committing money. Travelers need confidence that they can move safely beyond the airport. A modern terminal can become an impressive national symbol, but its economic value depends on the environment surrounding it. There are other difficult questions. European institutions have criticized Burkina Faso over the continuation of military rule and raised concerns about human rights and civic freedoms. Western governments have also watched Ouagadougou's growing relationship with Russia with suspicion. Supporters of Traore respond that Burkina Faso has the right to choose its own partners after decades of relationships that many Africans believe failed to deliver security or genuine economic independence. That argument deserves to be heard, but sovereignty should not mean exchanging one dependency for another. If dependence on France or another Western power limited African choices in the past, becoming excessively dependent on Russia, China, or any other outside power would create a similar strategic weakness. The stronger position is having options. That means developing African expertise, building national institutions, cooperating with neighboring countries, and working with outside partners when those partnerships serve national interests. This is why Burkina Faso's aviation experiment deserves attention. The ultimate test of Traore will not be how many supporters praise him or how many foreign governments criticize him. It will be whether institutions become stronger, security improves, infrastructure works, and ordinary people gain opportunities. If the airports succeed, while those foundations weaken, the achievement will remain incomplete. But if infrastructure, security, skills, and institutions advance together, Burkina Faso could offer Africa something more valuable than a political slogan. It could offer a model worth examining. What lessons can other African countries take from what is unfolding in Burkina Faso? The first is simple. Build people at the same time you build concrete. A government can spend millions of dollars on terminals, runways, and equipment, but those investments remain vulnerable if the country lacks engineers, technicians, airport managers, and aviation specialists capable of operating them. Training Africans to manage African infrastructure is not a secondary expense. It is part of the infrastructure itself. The second lesson is that strong leadership must eventually produce strong institutions. A leader such as Ibrahim Traore can set priorities and create political momentum, but an airport may operate for 50 years or longer. Its success cannot depend on one president. Professional institutions must survive political changes and continue managing national assets effectively. Third, Pan-Africanism becomes most powerful when ordinary people can experience it. A speech about African unity may inspire millions, but a reliable flight connecting Ouagadougou with Accra, Dakar, Nairobi, or another African city turns that idea into something practical. A farmer can reach a buyer, a business owner can enter another market, families can travel more easily, goods can move faster. Fourth, sovereignty should increase choices rather than eliminate partnerships. African countries do not need to reject Europe, the United States, Russia, China, or anyone else simply to prove their independence. They need enough domestic strength and enough diverse partnerships to negotiate according to African interests. That leads to perhaps the most important lesson. Do not measure sovereignty by slogans, measure it by results. Are more African professionals being trained? Are airports operating safely? Are new routes opening? Are transportation costs becoming more manageable? Are businesses reaching new customers? Are jobs being created? Can countries maintain their infrastructure without permanent dependence on outside expertise? Those questions matter far more than applause at any political rally. Burkina Faso has not yet answered all of them. Its aviation transformation remains unfinished, but that may be exactly why other African nations should watch closely. Because if this strategy succeeds, the lesson will not simply be that Burkina Faso built better airports. The deeper lesson will be that African cooperation, African expertise, capable institutions, and carefully chosen international partnerships can turn political independence into practical capacity. So, is Ouagadougou becoming a new center of African aviation? The most responsible answer today is not yet. But something important is being built, and the final verdict should come from measurable results. Watch the routes, watch passenger numbers, watch whether Ouagadougou Donsin becomes fully operational and commercially effective. Watch whether Bobo Dioulasso reaches its planned capacity. Watch how many African specialists are trained, and whether Air Burkina can develop sustainable connections with other African cities. Those results will tell us more than any political slogan. For Ibrahim Traore, this is also a test of leadership. Political determination can launch reforms and mobilize a nation, but lasting transformation requires institutions capable of functioning long after the speeches have ended. Supporters who see Captain Ibrahim Traore as a symbol of African sovereignty should therefore demand something stronger than symbolism. They should demand results that improve everyday life. That is where Pan-African thinking becomes practical. A truly Pan-African future is not simply African leaders standing together for photographs. It is Africans traveling between African cities more easily. It is African engineers sharing expertise. It is businesses reaching neighboring markets. It is countries cooperating through the African Union while retaining the ability to make decisions in their own national interest. For those searching for Africa new possibilities, Burkina Faso offers a story worth watching. It is not a finished success story. It is an experiment unfolding in real time. And perhaps that is the most useful meaning of Pan-Africanism today. Sovereignty should not mean isolation. It should mean having the knowledge, infrastructure, institutions, and choices required to determine your own direction. If Burkina Faso can turn airports into functioning gateways, training into lasting African expertise, and continental meetings into real connections between people and economies, Ouagadougou may earn a large plus on Africa's aviation map. If it cannot, the idea of a new aviation hub will remain an ambition. The runway is being prepared. The institutions are being tested. The connections are still being built. Now, Africa will watch what actually takes flight. If you want to follow the next chapter of Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, and Africa's changing future, subscribe to the channel. And tell us which African city you believe should become the continent's next great gateway. Thank you for being here and watching our video. Every piece of content on this channel is carefully researched, written, edited, and reviewed by our team to ensure it reflects our own work and editorial approach. We do not rely on automated mass production. Each video presents our perspective on current events related to President Ibrahim Traore and developments across Africa.